The dust did not care. It rose in a fine, tan mist from the hooves of listless horses and the shuffling boots of bored men, settling on everything with democratic indifference. It settled on the raw lumber of the new saloon, on the brim of the sheriff's hat, and on the sweat-slicked shoulders of the woman tied to the hitching post. She was a thing for sale, or perhaps just a thing for spectacle. Her feet were bare, the skin cracked and gray. A coarse burlap sack, cinched at the neck and with rough holes torn for her arms, was her only garment. It smelled of potatoes and damp earth. Her hair, a tangled mat of brown and straw, hung over her face, a curtain she refused to part. She had learned long ago that seeing the faces of the crowd only gave them more power. A man named Silas Croft, whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, paced before her. He gestured with a fat, ringed finger. He spoke of failed investments, of ingratitude, of property that had soured. The words washed over her, sounds without meaning, like the buzz of a trapped fly. The sun was a hammer on the back of her neck. Thirst was a stone in her throat. The crowd murmured. A few laughed at one of Croft's jests. A woman in a clean calico dress pulled her child closer, her lips a thin, hard line of disapproval that was aimed at the spectacle, not its cause. Most were simply there, watching the slow, unspooling cruelty of a Tuesday afternoon because there was nothing better to do. They were a gallery of dull eyes and slack jaws. Then, through the haze of heat and apathy, a stillness entered the edge of the square. He was a man built on a scale the arid land did not seem to support, tall and broad, a silhouette cut from stone against the shimmering sky. An Apache, the whispers named him, though none knew for certain. He lived alone in the stony hills that bled into the Badlands, a place where only stubborn things grew. His name was Nakai, but the townsfolk rarely used it. They spoke of him in terms of distance and shadow. He moved with a quiet economy that made the fidgeting townsmen look like startled birds. His duster was the color of the earth, his boots scuffed and pale with alkali dust. He did not look at Croft or the crowd. His gaze, dark and steady, settled on the woman. He carried whole winters in his eyes, a landscape of loss that recognized its own terrain in others. He saw the slump of her shoulders, the resignation that was heavier than any rope. He saw the way her fingers curled into loose fists at her sides, a last, unconscious protest. Croft's voice droned on, a greasy monologue of grievance. Nakai's attention was fixed on a place where the burlap sack had slipped, exposing the skin of her shoulder. There, stark against her sun-darkened flesh, was a brand, a small, vicious circle with a spike driven through its center. It was an old mark, the scar tissue pale and puckered. The air in Nakai's lungs seemed to turn to ice. The buzzing of the crowd faded to a distant hum. The world narrowed to that single, hateful sigil. It was the mark of the Cobra Canyon mines, a place that ate men and spat out copper, a place that had swallowed his sister 14 years ago, a place from which no one returned. Croft finally noticed the tall man's unnerving stillness. "Something I can help you with, friend?" The word friend was a barb. Nakai did not answer him. His eyes remained on the woman, but a subtle shift occurred in his posture. He was no longer a passive observer. He was an anchor, and the tide of the day was about to turn around him. He took a slow step forward, then another. The dust barely seemed to stir beneath his feet. The crowd grew quiet, their boredom replaced by a new, sharper interest. This was different. This was not part of the show. "I'll take her," Nakai said. The voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together under a river. It was not a request. Croft blinked, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Take her? She ain't for taking. She's for..." Making an example of, he puffed out his chest. "Besides, what would you want with used-up property like this?" Nakai's gaze finally lifted from the woman to meet Croft's. For a moment the world held its breath. The silence stretched thin, ready to snap. Nakai reached into a pocket of his duster and pulled out a clutch of coins. Not many. They were dull, worn things. He tossed them onto the ground in the dust between Croft's polished boots. They landed with a soft, final clink. "That settles your grievance," Nakai stated. Croft's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The insult was profound. He was being dismissed, his entire performance bought for less than the price of a decent meal. Pride and greed wrestled on his face. He glanced at the silent, imposing figure of Nakai, at the hard set of his jaw, and then at the coins in the dust. Greed won. It usually did. He stooped, grunting with the effort, and snatched the coins. "Fine. She's your problem now." Nakai turned his back on him. He walked to the post, his shadow falling over the woman. She flinched, pulling in on herself, a creature bracing for another blow. He did not speak. He pulled a small, sharp knife from his belt. The blade caught the sun, a sliver of painful light. She squeezed her eyes shut. She heard the rasp of the blade, not against her skin, but against the coarse fibers of the rope. One slice, two. The tension across her chest and arms gave way. The ropes fell into the dust. He stepped back immediately, giving her space, a quiet recognition of her terror. He stood waiting, his hands loose at his sides. The crowd watched, unsure what to make of this silent transaction. For a long moment, she did not move. Freedom was a language she had forgotten. Then, slowly, shakily, she pushed herself away from the post. Her legs trembled. She kept her head down, her world still confined to the patch of dirt at her feet. He turned and began to walk away, his pace measured and slow, not looking back to see if she followed. It was not a command. It was an invitation, written in the language of open space. She hesitated. The dust held the imprint of his boots. Behind her was the known misery of the town. Ahead was a man who looked like he was carved from the mountains themselves, a silence that could be a threat or a sanctuary. She took a single, faltering step, then another. She followed the quiet giant out of the town, the dust rising behind them like the ghosts of who they used to be. The journey was a long, silent pilgrimage. The sun beat down, and the land offered no shade. The man, Nakai, walked ahead, his stride long but unhurried. He never looked back, yet she felt his awareness of her as a tangible thing, a tether between them. He moved as if he were a part of the landscape, his silence as natural as the wind that whispered through the sagebrush. After an hour, he stopped. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder and set it on a flat rock behind him before walking a dozen paces away to stare out at the horizon. He was giving her privacy to drink. Her throat was a knot of fire. She crept forward, her hands shaking as she lifted the heavy canteen. The water was warm, metallic, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She drank slowly, carefully, then replaced the cap and scurried back, leaving the canteen where he had put it. He retrieved it without a word, and they continued on. It was their first conversation. His home was not a house. It was a shelter, crouched against the side of a rocky bluff as if seeking protection from the sky. The cabin was made of weathered, silvered wood, the lines stark and unadorned. It looked less like it was built and more like it had grown there. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, a sign of life in the vast emptiness. Beside the cabin was a small, fenced-in patch of earth, a garden struggling valiantly against the dry soil. And just beyond that, a single humble grave marked with a pile of carefully chosen river stones. He led her to the door and pushed it open. The inside was as spare as the outside. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 stools, a cot in one corner. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something else, a deep, lingering loneliness. It was clean, meticulously so. Every object had its place. He gestured toward a small, curtained-off alcove. "That room is yours," his voice, after the long silence, seemed to startle the air. He then pointed to the main room. "I will be here." He moved to the hearth, where a pot of something simmered over the low embers. He ladled a thin stew into 2 wooden bowls, placing one on the table for her. She stood frozen in the doorway, a ghost haunting the threshold of a new life. He did not press her. He simply sat on one of the stools and began to eat, his movements deliberate. There was no lock on the door. He had not closed it behind them. The unspoken contract settled in the quiet space between them. Food, shelter, an open door. He was offering her safety, not demanding her servitude. Slowly, drawn by the smell of the food and the profound exhaustion in her bones, she moved to the table. She sat on the edge of the stool, poised to flee, and ate. The stew was mostly beans and wild herbs, but it was warm. It filled a hollowness inside her that had been there for years. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against wood and the soft crackle of the fire. When they were done, he took both bowls to a basin of water and washed them. She watched his large hands, surprisingly gentle as they handled the simple crockery. He did not look at her, but he knew she was watching. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. They lived in parallel, their lives intersecting only at the edges. He would rise before the sun, his movements quiet as he stoked the fire and left the cabin. She would wake to the warmth and find a piece of bread or a bowl of cornmeal left for her on the table. She began to claim small pieces of the space for herself. First, she swept the floor with a broom made of tied branches, the repetitive motion a comfort. She scrubbed the table until the wood grain showed clean and pale. She learned the landscape of the cabin. The loose floorboard by the hearth, the way the late afternoon sun cast a perfect golden rectangle on the far wall. He would work outside, mending the fence around the small garden, chopping wood with a powerful, rhythmic grace, or disappearing into the hills for hours, returning with a rabbit or a clutch of bitter roots. He never asked her for anything, never told her what to do. He simply created a space, and she began to inhabit it. One afternoon, while he was gone, she wandered over to the small, stone-marked grave. Weeds were beginning to encroach on the edges. Hesitantly, she knelt and began to pull them, her fingers working the dry, stubborn soil. When the patch was clear, she saw a single, tenacious wildflower growing near the fence line, a splash of defiant purple against the brown earth. She picked it and laid it gently on the largest river stone at the head of the grave. It was a small gesture, an answer to the water he had given her on their journey. When he returned at dusk, he stopped by the grave. He stood there for a long time, his back to the cabin, looking at the small flower. She watched him from the doorway, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. He did not say anything when he came inside. But that evening, as a chill wind began to whip down from the bluffs, she found a thick wool shawl, old but clean, folded neatly on her bed. They stitched their lives together with these raw threads of unspoken kindness. He noticed the handle on the water bucket was splintered, and one morning she found it wrapped tightly and smoothly with new leather. She took the torn sleeve of his duster while he slept and mended it with careful, tiny stitches, using thread she'd unraveled from the hem of her burlap sack. The sack was the last relic of her old life. She had washed it and now wore it like a simple tunic, but it was still a reminder. One evening, as the fire burned low, she took the knife he used for skinning rabbits. He always left it on the mantel, and began to methodically cut the sack into long, thin strips. He watched her, his face impassive in the flickering firelight, but he did not stop her. She braided the strips into a rough cord, a useless, symbolic thing. The nights were the hardest. The silence of the cabin was a vast, empty canvas, and her memory painted it with horrors. She would often wake with a gasp, the phantom feel of ropes on her skin, the jeering laughter of the crowd echoing in her ears. One night, a particularly vivid dream sent her stumbling from her alcove, a strangled cry caught in her throat. She stood trembling in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, the firelight catching the wild terror in her eyes. Nakai, who had been sitting by the dying embers, rose slowly to his feet. He did not move toward her. He simply stood there, a solid, unshakable presence in the shifting shadows. "Please," she whispered, the word broken and raw. It was the first time she had spoken to him in weeks, the first time she had initiated any sound at all. Her voice was thin as a fence rail. "Please, don't send me back." His expression did not change, but a deep sadness moved in his eyes. "You are not going back," he said, his voice low and certain. "This is your home now, if you will have it." She stared at him, the terror in her receding, replaced by a fragile, tentative hope. He was a man who spoke in promises as solid as the rock his house was built on. He bent down and added a log to the fire. The flames leaped up, chasing the shadows back into the corners, filling the small cabin with warmth and a soft, orange light. She did not return to her bed. She sank to the floor on the other side of the hearth and watched the fire until the sun came up. He sat with her the whole time, sharing the silence. The first snow came early, a fine powder that dusted the bluffs and clung to the needles of the stubborn pines. It softened the harsh lines of the land, blanketing it in a quiet peace. The routine of their life held firm against the cold. The cabin became their entire world, a small arc of warmth adrift in a sea of white. He taught her things without lessons. She watched him set snares and learned where to find the driest kindling. He would bring in herbs and lay them out, and she learned to distinguish the ones for tea from the ones for seasoning. She, in turn, brought a new life to the cabin's interior. She found a way to make the bread rise higher, and the stew seemed to have more flavor. She once even tried to hum a tune she barely remembered, a quiet, broken melody that filled the space for a moment before she fell silent, blushing. He had pretended not to notice, but the corner of his mouth had twitched, the barest hint of a smile. One day he returned from a trip to the distant, smaller settlement where he traded pelts, his face grim. He placed a small parcel on the table, wrapped in brown paper. Inside were needles, thick thread, and several yards of dark blue wool cloth. He did not need to explain. She understood. The burlap was a brand of its own. She worked for days, her fingers clumsy at first, then growing more sure. She cut and stitched a simple dress, functional and warm. The day she finally put it on, she felt a profound shift inside her. She stood straighter. She burned the braided cord of burlap in the fire, watching until it was nothing but black ash. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The piece was a fragile thing, a skin of ice over a deep, cold river. They both knew it. The harbinger came on a day when the wind had a mean streak, scouring the snow into frozen drifts. It wasn't a letter or a rider. It was a shape on the horizon, a smudge of darkness against the white, then two shapes, then four. Riders moving slowly but deliberately toward the cabin. Nakai saw them from the ridge where he was checking his traps. He came back to the cabin not in a hurry, but with a terrifying purpose in his stride. He did not have to say a word. She saw his face, and the quiet life they had built together shattered like glass. He checked the old rifle he kept above the mantel, his movements economical and precise. He looked at her. Stay inside, away from the door. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. But this time, something else rose with it. A hot, fierce anger. This small cabin, this quiet man, this fragile piece, they were hers. She had earned them with her silence and her work and her slow, painful healing. The riders stopped a short distance from the cabin, their horses steaming in the frigid air. Silas Croft was in the lead, looking colder and meaner than he had in the summer dust. He had brought 3 other men with him, hard-faced men with rifles resting across their saddles. Nakai stepped out of the cabin, closing the door behind him. He stood on the small porch, not with the rifle, but with his arms hanging loose at his sides. He was a mountain that refused to be moved. Nakai! Croft's voice was thin and sharp in the cold air. I've come for my property. She is not your property, Nakai said. His voice a low rumble that seemed to be pulled from the earth itself. I got a bill of sale, Croft sneered, patting his coat. Says I bought her from the copper mines, fair and square. The brand proves it. She's mine by law. He looked past Nakai, at the closed door of the cabin. Send her out. No, Nakai said. The word was flat, final. Croft's face tightened. Don't be a fool. There are 4 of us. We can burn this shack to the ground with you in it. Give me the girl, and we'll ride out. Inside, she was pressed against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. The girl. He was still calling her a thing, an object. But she was not a girl. She was not a thing. She looked around the small room, at the mended duster hanging on a peg, at the 2 bowls sitting clean on the shelf, at the simple blue dress she wore. This was her life. She did not know what possessed her. It was an impulse born of fire and fear and a desperate, burgeoning love for this quiet sanctuary. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. It was cold and solid in her hands. As Croft's men began to dismount, their intentions clear, the cabin door swung open. She stepped out into the biting wind, her face pale but her eyes blazing. She stood beside Nakai, the iron poker held tight in her grip. She was thin as a whip, no match for these men, but she stood there anyway. A sapling next to an oak, but rooted in the same ground. Croft stared, his jaw dropping in genuine surprise. He had expected a cowering animal. He did not know what to make of the woman who met his gaze without flinching. Her name, Nakai said, his voice rising just enough to cut through the wind, is Lena. The word hung in the air. A name. It was a shield, a claim, a declaration of humanity that Croft's talk of bills of sale and property could not breach. He had taken her from the post, but in that moment he gave her back to herself. Lena. Croft sputtered, thrown off balance. I don't care what you call it. It's mine. No, she said. Her own voice surprised her. It was stronger than she'd imagined, hardened by the cold air. I am not. That was it. That was the blow that Croft could not counter. It was not the threat of Nakai's formidable size, or the poker she held like a scepter. It was their unity. They stood together, 2 broken people who had somehow become a fortress. Croft saw it in their eyes, a resolve that his greed and threats could not penetrate. He was a man who understood transactions, not loyalty. He could not profit here. He cursed, a vile string of words that the wind snatched away. He looked at his men, who now seemed less sure of themselves, their eyes shifting between the defiant woman and the silent, immovable man beside her. This was not the easy work they had been promised. With another curse, Croft wrenched his horse around. It ain't worth it, he spat, more to himself than to anyone else. He spurred his horse, and his men, relieved, followed him. They rode away, their dark shapes shrinking against the vast white expanse until they were gone. They stood there for a long time after the riders had vanished, the cold air stinging their cheeks. The silence that descended was different from any they had shared before. It was not empty. It was full of the battle they had just won. The world felt new, scrubbed clean by the snow and the confrontation. Lena's hand was trembling, and the iron poker suddenly felt immensely heavy. She let it fall with a soft thud into the snow. Nakai turned to her. His dark eyes were full of a deep, quiet emotion she couldn't name. He reached out not to touch her, but to gently take her hand. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was incredibly warm. He simply held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. Lena, he said again softly, as if trying the name out, making sure it fit. She looked up at him, and for the first time she truly saw him. Not as a rescuer, not as a giant, but as a man who carried his own scars. Why? She asked, her voice a whisper. The brand. You knew it. He nodded, his gaze distant for a moment, looking back into the winter of his own past. My sister, he said, his voice thick with old grief. She was taken to the mines. She had a mark like it. Her name was Lena, too. The confession settled between them, a final, painful, beautiful piece of the puzzle. He had not saved a stranger. He had saved a memory. He had honored a ghost. And in doing so, he had given life to a new person. Tears welled in her eyes, hot against her cold skin. They were not tears of fear or sadness, but of a profound, aching gratitude. She did not pull her hand away. That night the cabin was different. The house, which had long held its breath in mourning, finally breathed again. It was no longer his shelter and her sanctuary. It was their home. They ate their simple meal, the silence comfortable and deep. Later, as the fire burned low, he sat mending a piece of leather, and she sat stitching the hem of her new dress. The quiet work of building a life. A child came with the spring thaw, a boy with her eyes and a quiet strength that was all his own. He was born into a world of two people, a world defined by the scent of pine and wood smoke, by the sound of a low, steady voice and the sight of a wildflower on a pile of stones. Years passed. The lines of grief on Nakai's face softened. Lena's laughter, when it came, was a rare and precious sound, like water in the desert. The boy grew and his world was safe. He would call the man who chopped the wood and taught him to read the tracks in the dust by his name, Nakai. And sometimes, when the three of them sat on the porch watching the sun bleed its blood-orange light across the horizon, he would lean his small head against the man's knee, and a different word would come, quiet and sure. Father. The house remained, a testament against the harshness of the land. It was a place built not of wood and stone, but of small, repeated kindnesses. It was proof that sometimes the only way to heal a wound is to tend to the wounds of another. This story, it isn't just about a rescue in the dust of a forgotten town. It's about the quiet courage it takes to see the human being inside the label someone else has given them. It's about recognizing a piece of your own pain in a stranger's eyes and choosing to act, not with pity, but with a profound and silent respect. So here is your naming. In your own life, you will come across people who have been tied to a post, branded by their past, and dismissed by the crowd. You will have a choice, to be part of the noise, or to be the silence that offers a drink of water. You can choose to see the property, or you can choose to learn the name. Most people will walk on by. They will see the burlap sack and the downcast eyes and assume that's the whole story. But if you're brave, if you're quiet enough to listen past the noise, you might just find that the person you thought you were saving is the very one who will end up saving you right back. Because fire only changes everything if something new and true is waiting in the ash.